afternoon. Today on the PIO podcast, welcome to Todd Fox, founder and managing director of Close Protection Group. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
So, Todd, you have an extensive military background, and I don't want to miss something of interest. Can you give us a rundown of your knowledge and background?
Yeah, I started off in the Marine Corps as a young guy in the early 90s. I spent a lot of time bouncing around in the Marine Corps doing everything from washing dishes to operating with Joint Task Force 6, which is a project with the DEA that the military has. I got out of the Marine Corps, started working in protective details in Latin America. From there, I started doing contract work and then ended up in law enforcement, setting up and standing up a SRT team in the St. Louis area.
So you've done a fair amount, DEA, working in the Marines, and then setting up a tactical team in the St. Louis. So let's talk about your professional expertise is in the use of force incidents. So it's something you spent a considerable amount of time on developing. Why is that?
In 1996, I started wrestling at the same time I started martial arts, karate, and boxing and all this stuff. And when I went in the Marine Corps, I ended up specializing in that. I worked with a law enforcement officer in the St. Louis area to help develop a program that they had. At the time, they were kind of relegated to PPCT, and I don't know if anybody knows what that is, but it's not super effective. And the components that were very effective in the old days were kind of pushed out because they were effective. And so I worked with them starting in 95. And then I became a professional fighter. I fought in MMA before it was MMA. It was called NHB or No Holds Barred. And I still work with law enforcement agency. I still work with the Marine Corps. And what I found is that there's a massive difference. There's a disconnect between what the public thinks law enforcement officers get and what they actually get. And then the quality of instruction they get, dedication to that particular component of training, and then all of the other training that takes precedence over it. And so I started to have to work within the constraints of law enforcement, and I developed a few programs specific to agencies, in this case, state agencies, and then eventually federal agencies, and then working with bodies like Post to get it certified. And being in the St. Louis area, there's no lack of action and activity. It's high ops tempo in this area, so you get to see what works and what doesn't work.
So let's talk about use of force incidents involving law enforcement officers. What do you see as a contributing factor to the use of force? And then I have a follow-up to that.
Ooh, that's it's complex because it's multifaceted, right? You look at law. So the vast majority of people on the civilian side don't understand use of force from a legal perspective, right? When you get into case law, Graham Connor and Tennessee Garner and Scott Henrich, and you get into state statutes, they don't understand what it is. They think it's one thing. And that also includes law enforcement. I've talked to a lot of different agencies and senior staff, command staff, who don't understand it. They think the law says that they must use the least force necessary. And while that may be a policy, that's not the law. And it's interesting to talk to them about specific cases like Scott Henrich. It needs to be objectively reasonable. And then obviously, as you know, with the Graham factors, when you talk about severity of the crime, the immediacy of the threat, the level of resistance faced, all those factors come into play. So there's the actual law. Then there comes the agency and what type of activities they're seeing in their region and what the community tolerates for them. And in the hiring process in particular, what I've noticed is that because use of force are very rare relative to law enforcement contacts, the focus is going to be on communicating, right? It's going to be on talking to people and being effective there. It's not going to be focused on the capabilities, let's say, high risk, low frequency events like use of force. So in the training module, you don't see anything extreme or severe in most cases. They train them to a minimum standard when it comes to use of force. So what happens is if you get a person who's never been punched in the face in training, when it happens in real life, they default very frequently to a higher level of force. And in many cases, that is the firearm. And so, let's say I've been boxing my whole life and you punch me in the face, I don't think it's lethal because I know that getting punched in the face is not lethal 99% of the time. And so I don't default to going to lethal force. So I think it's multi-factor. It's knowing the laws. It's the agency's selection of officers, how they train those officers, and the community's perspective, and trying to kind of fit all of those pieces together. And as you know, the news is going to play the sound bites that work for them, and that's not always in favor of the law enforcement officer. And, it misses context in almost all of the cases.
Yeah, and, there's still the general public perception of that, why didn't the officer just wing him? Shoot him in the arm. I mean, I've heard that I don't know how many times in the
Yeah,
general public. And
that shows a lack of understanding, one, of firearms and responsible usage of firearms, and thinking about things like backstop, thinking about the fact that if I shoot them, number one, it's not going to disable them, which is my intention for shooting them in the first place, right? So, people, if you shoot them in the arm, they can still use their other arms, their two legs, they can still move, they can still kill you or hurt you. And so it's very limited understanding. And one of the things that I think we fail as a community to do is educate the public on why it is that we don't do those things, and trying to get in front of that so they understand the law, they understand the training, and put them in scenarios. I know sometimes the local agencies do, citizen academies and things like that. And sometimes they're useful if they're set up in the proper way. But, those ideas I think are old, like, well, you should have shot him in the arm or the leg. Like, you missed the point, and let's talk about that, instead of kind of saying, no, we can't do that. Explain why we can't do that. Show them what happens when that occurs. And then the other things, the cost of doing that, what happens, when you get sued as a small agency for making that choice, thinking you're making the right choice, and then disabling that individual. So it's multi-factor again, it's multi-front, and a lot of times we're not getting out in front of that stuff.
all right, so one of the things that you've been doing is working with tactical defensive tactics instructors at all levels in government. And what have you learned since you started working with them?
I learned mostly on the front end that they have a ton of restrictions. So you look at what their agency policy allows them to do. That's number one. You look at the time allotted. You look at what's bumping them out, what courses are bumping them out. And then also the level of commitment of the individual officer. If you look at things like promotions, right? Never does a promotion board consider how proficient you are, how much DT you've done. It doesn't look at that. It doesn't look at your fitness standards, right? Those things are not considered. So they're not incentivized, which means that an officer, if they want to be promoted, if they're motivated, they're going to attack the fronts that really contribute to their promotion. The guys that want to train, that are focused on training, they're going to train. They don't need guys like me. They're going to go out and they're going to find the guys that are pros. They're going to learn the stuff they have to learn, and they're going to try to pass on to the people that want to hear it. The things that I see frequently with a lot of agencies, not all, is that you see command staff who show up and they kind of just call it in. You don't see them training, you don't see them working. And when we talk about leading from the front, the way to lead from the front is to do the thing that you're supposed to be training. You want your officers proficient in it. Show them that it's important. How do you show them it's important? By doing the thing that you sent them to train on. And so, you got to get buy-in from the officers. And I think that's a missing component. And of everything that I've learned, that's the biggest thing, is they see they don't have to do it. They don't have to be good at it. And as I noted earlier, uses of force are so infrequent relative to law enforcement contacts in the US, regardless of what the public thinks. And people can get away with not having those skills. But when it happens and they need it, that they don't, are very obvious that they don't have those skills. So that's what I've learned over the years in working with these guys.
And ultimately it goes bad when it falls apart and they can't do effective tactics.
No, I think there's one more component that a lot of people fail to see, the community and law enforcement as well, is that you don't get to pick the time, you don't get to pick the place, you don't get to pick the method of attack. As a Leo, you're only picking the response to those things. So the bad guy picks the time, the place, and the method of attack, and then you pick the response. And hopefully it's something that you've done before, seen before, that you're prepared before, like a recognition prime decision making from Klein, where you go, okay, I've been here before, I know what the solution is to this, and I can shortcut it. But those are factors that I don't hear talked about a lot, is you're behind the power curve and making these decisions when it comes to use of force. It's very difficult to be on the front end of it.
Oh, it's almost never on the front end. It's just not in the nature of law enforcement to take a active role in stopping something like that unless they roll up and it's a gunfight. It just doesn't happen. So Todd, you recently published a new book called Underpinning. What is the book about and why did you write it?
I wrote the book for a very specific reason, which is that there are a ton of guys who've never served in law enforcement teaching law enforcement right now. It's the flavor of the moment with MMA guys and jiu-jitsu guys. And I come from those communities. I have a 4th degree black belt in jiu-jitsu. I have 3 black belts and I've competed professionally. I'm a national champion in jiu-jitsu at black belt level, and I've got a ton of accolades. None of that matters if I don't understand the context in which officers operate, right? So I need to be able to understand that first. The first thing that I need to understand is again, what are the laws? What, laws in terms of constitutional law, statutory law, what are the agency policies? And then what is the aesthetic factor that also contributes to the techniques that I'm teaching? For example, what is the community going to see when they see that technique? And then start to talk to guys that are trainers about methods and ideologies and processes. And looking at a situation through a completely different lens than they would in a controlled environment. When you think about martial arts, including MMA, which again I come from, you have a controlled space, right? You have this cage, and the only thing in the cage, two fighters who have a set of rules that they're operating under, and a referee in case things go bad to protect them. They also have the same weight class. They also have the general same experience level. They also have more or less kind of the same objective, and they have to operate within this time frame. None of that exists on the law enforcement front. If you're wearing gear, 30, 40, 50 pounds of gear, you face another problem, which is Hick's law, right? You have all these options on your duty belt, and you think as a normal person that more options is better. And in reality, it just creates confusion because there's so many options that you have to cycle through that mentally to figure out what's the right one. And cycling through that slows you down in your decision making. So fighters don't have that in a ring, in a cage, in a confined space. Another factor out on the street is you deal with multiple people. Almost always the officer is outnumbered in almost all scenarios. You're also talking about an environment that's not a mat. It's not a tatame. It's not a cage or a ring that has soft canvas. You're talking about hard vehicles. You're talking about asphalt. You're talking about concrete. And when you go into a cage, no one has a weapon. So now you're talking about guns and knives and blunt force trauma type tools like bats and things like that. So it just is much more complex. And if you go in there and try and teach them what you do in an MMA fight or in a jiu-jitsu competition, there are things to be learned, but it doesn't translate. And so if you leave it to the individual officer to try to translate it, it's very difficult. So the book kind of sheds light on the factors, the elements that they need to learn if they want to be effective at teaching Leo. So, processes of learning and how they learn and thinking about, operating within, say, post standards and writing a curriculum that functions within that state or agency standards. Then on top of that, within the time frame, because if you look at the national standard in the United States, to be a defensive tactics instructor is 40 hours. You can barely do anything in 40 hours. So now how do you maximize that 40 hours? And how do you keep the attention of people who have short attention spans and who want to be in charge and think they know everything already? It's a very, very challenging thing. So the book shed lights on all of those topics, and it tries to kind of lead guys with limited experience in their realm down the path to being good at what they do, to really being a service to the law enforcement officer and by proxy, the community as a whole.
So you brought up a thought, goes back to the whole rear naked choke or the choke hold that most law enforcement agencies are now completely barred from using. But if they're used effectively and if they're done the right way, they can usually end a fight rather quickly without much harm to anybody on either side. But again, part of that is not properly trained and so on.
Yeah, 100%. So you're spot on. So first is the vernacular. Like, what are we calling it and why are we calling it? And, what distinguishes? So you say rear naked choke, which is the common term in martial arts, which basically is a bilateral neck restraint that compresses the carotid and reduces the flow of blood to the brain and renders them unconscious. Then their heart rate goes down, their blood pressure goes down. You can set them down gently and move on. So in law enforcement, any type of choke as a broad stroke is not permitted. Some agencies, including the state that I'm in, allow for a vascular neck restraint or lateral vascular neck restraint, depending on who you talk to. And it's a super effective technique. Now, when you're talking about neck restraints, it can be with or without compression, meaning holding the position, or actually compressing, and it can be blood or air. Now, no law enforcement agency in the United States allows for any type of airway restriction, blood restriction, and that's an important distinction. So what you're noting, for example, is when you're side to side, right? So the carotids are on the side, and you're going side to side versus front to back, which is airway. And that's where the problems have come from. And while, there haven't been massive amounts of death, the general perception amongst the public and agencies is that it was so problematic. But to your point, in my case with martial arts, I've witnessed thousands, and I don't mean hundreds or, 900, I mean thousands of times people be rendered unconscious with a rear naked choke or lateral vascular neck restraint, depending on how you want to frame it, with no repercussions. All the data is there, all the science is there. You can go to all kinds of people in emergency rooms and look at that and see kind of how this unfolds. We have that data. The problem is it's a liability and it's a risk to the perception of the agency. So by and large, as you noted, most states don't allow it. Most local agencies don't allow it. It's gone away. And it's a sad thing because it's extremely effective technique that does not hurt a person by and large.
Right. Todd, there's a phrase that a lot of legislators now are starting to attack, and it's the warrior cop versus the guardian officer, and that perspective has really gone into it. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's something that I've noticed the last maybe 3 to 5 years, and a lot of it came from resistance to Colonel Grossman's stuff, on combat, on killing, all of these things, and training cops to be warriors. There are some things that don't translate, right? And I come from both realms, so I can tell you, if you have a Marine and he's coming in and teaching something, he may say, yeah, and this is where we're going to do. Well, in law enforcement, as you know, we can't use suppressive fire. It doesn't work that way. So those kinds of things don't translate. But now this whole, very broad, wide thing like mentality, meaning you can have a warrior's mentality, I don't agree with, because very simply put, if you're going to send a law enforcement officer into harm's way, the most important thing they can have is their mindset, their brain, how they look at a problem, how they solve problems. And in my personal opinion, Leos are problem solvers. That's what they're there to do. They're community servants who solve problems that no one else wants to solve. And if you're going to send them to really nasty situations, which is going to happen, you need them to have a warrior's mindset. Now, that changes nothing when it comes to techniques. The techniques are the techniques, and the techniques that work for the military or that are permitted in the military are not always permitted in law enforcement. And that's right. That's justifiable. But the mindset is extremely important. And I understand the argument that some legislators believe that they're making law enforcement officers into these warriors who think they're in a war zone. The problem is some of them are in war zones, and they need to have that mindset not only to protect themselves, but to protect the community. So it has to be able to ebb and flow. You have to be able to adjust. And if you condition a person so that they can deal with that kind of problem and solve that kind of problem, they're going to be more relaxed in that environment, and they're going to have that recognition prime decision making. They're not going to over respond. You've got to deal with little kids, and you've got to deal with old people, and you've got to deal with people with mental illness and all kinds of problems. And you train for that. And the reason that you train for that is so that you have that skill set available to you in that moment. But if you're going to send them into harm's way, and you're going to send them into a spot where people are trained up and they're using things like AK, and you've got this officer who doesn't even have a patrol rifle going in with a 9mm to fight them, 2 of them, 3 of them, it makes no sense. It doesn't fit the problem. And so we need to train them up to the degree that we can with the time available, the finances available, but we need their minds trained first. And a warrior mindset allows you to survive and thrive in chaos. And ultimately, in law enforcement, you're forced into chaos frequently. So the mindset component, I don't agree with the people that say that you shouldn't teach Leos to be warriors. I understand what they're saying when they talk about techniques, and I understand what they're saying when they say that law enforcement officers not in a war zone. Most of the time that's true, but not all of the time.
Well, just a thought I had that popped in my mind about the whole training aspect that you're talking about, like to be an instructor. You're saying an instructor is 40 hours in most states, then they're certified. They can then go ahead and teach other officers to do techniques that they may not even have mastered, because in my experience, 40 hours is not mastery of anything.
No, you're right. I mean, when we start to look at that, I think generally accepted is 10 hours for mastery, but in reality, that's what it is. And I can say, you know what, I'm not going to take this 40-hour instructor's course. I'm not going to sell this or to provide this to an agency. Or I can say, you know what, I'm going to do what I can within 40 hours and make it as good as possible. I think by and large, the problem, as you know, is recruiting suffering across the nation, number one, because of the response to law enforcement, in particular 20 to 20. But with that response, meaning the low turnout for recruiting, you're getting these low quality guys, and they're sending them to a basic level of training because they don't have the manpower to staff the streets. And if I say, hey, I need your guy for 3 months, they're not going to pull a guy off the street for 3 months. It's really like pulling teeth to get them for 1 week. So I have to work within the framework that exists, but I agree, the level of mastery is very low. And then if you don't have follow on, how can you be expected not just to teach it, but to be able to do it under stress? That's the factor that also is not talked about frequently. Like, I'm doing this in training and the agency doesn't want me to induce stress, but the reality is I want them proficient under stress, right? So if I'm just going through the motions and they're learning these techniques, but they're not getting it under stress, it's no good. So again, in that 40 hours, now I have to not just get them trained up, but I have to test them under stress. And it can be a lot of different stressors, but they need to be commensurate with the levels of stress they're going to face as long as it keeps them safe in training. So the reality is right now that, most agencies are not going to jump out in front of that curve and say, look, this isn't it. Again, because most of the time people aren't having uses of force. And when they do, they tend to be resolved pretty quick. They stay on the low end of the spectrum. So I don't see that changing. I wish that would change. I think that it's too low. But right now, talking to, local, state, and federal agencies and the command staffs in each of those, I don't see it changing anytime soon. The best that I can hope for is to offer kind of continuing ongoing training to those individuals that come to the class for free, saying, hey, now that you've done this, you need to stay proficient at it and you need to update your skills as time goes on. And you need to see all the different variables that change in this equation so that you can address them with your students. And you can do it for free. Come see me, come to my gym. It's not going to cost you anything. And I'm noticing a trend in that too. I'm seeing a lot of gyms open up to Leos for free BJJ training in particular. So that's a positive thing, but it's not happening at the agency. It's happening in the private sector. And I think that's because they realize the trickle down.
And the problem with that is when you don't have the agencies training their people, when that use of force occurs, the impact of that later, especially when the use of force goes bad, it's a lot more expensive on that end than it was if they would have put the training out in the beginning.
Absolutely. And in fact, I keep all my local, state, federal certs active. And not long ago, I was at a FLETC use of force instructor program. And one of the things that they said, shockingly to me, because I've been saying this for 30 years, is that more force on the front end frequently equals less force on the back end. So if you deal with it right in the beginning, you don't have it unfold into this thing that is very costly in the end. And while I was surprised to hear him say that, they're absolutely right when you look at case studies and you review these things. So that's a major fact.
The other thing that I like about what you're saying is the stress-induced stress during an incident or during training. And I go back to an incident that happened up in the Metro Chicago area in the last several months where they went into a home in regards to a domestic dispute, and they went in with a body bunker, shield, and 3 officers, and then there was a shot fired, and you can't tell because the body camera has been obstructed because of the shield, but it's my opinion is it was a sympathetic pull based off of a reaction to somebody behind a door when they open a door. And that to me is not, it goes to that experience, to that training in the officer in a high stress situation, not knowing what's behind a door, never having trained that way. And now they have a fatality on their hands.
Yeah. And that's just it. And that's again why, from my side of things, I can teach you technique and you can do the technique with no stress, but you're never going to be applying most of those techniques without stress. They're going to be punching in the face. They're going to be kicking. There's going to be 2 of them. They're going to be using a weapon. You're going to be pinned against the car or under the car. You're going to be in a doorway or coming out of a window or whatever it may be when it happens. And so you're going to have the auditory exclusion. You're going to have the tunnel vision. You're going to have these factors. Each person's going to get something different and to a different degree. But again, as we hire people who are without street experience, they're going to respond typically to a much greater degree. And they're going to have these responses, like where something sets them off quick because they're not used to dealing with these stressors. And so managing the stressor is a big part of the training, right? You've been exposed to it. Okay, it's a bit of stress inoculation. It's a bit of a misnomer to say that, but the idea is there, right? I expose you to it repeatedly and a little bit more each time, and you become used to it, and you can do the move just fine that way. So we're doing a technique without resistance, and then we're doing it against a wall without resistance, and now we're doing it with 10% or 20% resistance, and now we're doing it with 50 and 100%, and now I'm squirting you in the face with water, and now you're getting hit with a shock knife. Now you can't hear or see something because we've managed to take away your senses. Now it's 2 people. So as we add those or stack those, it becomes more stressful, and it also becomes more realistic. And the more that they learn to operate and function and perform those techniques in those environments, the better they are for the community as a law enforcement officer.
Yeah, isn't that amazing how you bring about the realistic experience, and most training that I've seen is always done on good weather days, typically warm, typically sunny. It's not an inclement, cold, rainy, and all the other environments that we're in. And, that it does not start to set any kind of mentality for that person just going into the training.
100%. And a lot of it's just check the box training. They're going through the motions, but ideal conditions, nothing happens in ideal conditions. I don't recall one situation, whether it's military or law enforcement or protective services, that it went down in perfect conditions. It just doesn't happen that way. And so, I've had some agencies give me resistance on this, and I've had some that we've parted ways on this. But when we train, we will train inside in a mat room, and then we'll move outside with protective gear. We'll be on concrete, we'll be on rocks, we'll be in water, we'll be on sand. If you remind me, I'll send you some photos of this, because it's extremely odd now in 20 to see this kind of training. But the reality is that's where it happens. How is it that you're not going to train them in the environment that it occurs in? And then again, we're going to do 2-on-1, and we're going to start to affect your stress. Everything you're doing is going to be where your heart rate's up, whether that means we did some physical fitness at advance, or I hoodwinked you before we did it, whatever it may be, we're creating or inducing that stress. And then you're going to show your level of proficiency under stress, because that's what's going to happen. And it's going to be worse than that. So, if I get guys that come back and say, hey, this thing happened and your scenario was worse than reality, that's a positive thing. That's a good thing. I want them to experience that first. And then when they have the thing to deal with, the situation that unfolds in whatever scenario that they face on the streets, they're prepared. They're ready to go home. And again, if I think about who's responding to an emergency for me personally, I want somebody that's been through that. I don't want somebody that's afraid of their shadow. So I think about these things in terms of my community and the people that are working around me when I'm teaching or training these guys.
So, Todd, what can officers do if they don't have an adequate training program in their own agency? What can they do?
Well, I think there's a lot in the way of DT right now, and there's also a lot in the way of firearms available to communities. When you see, not to get on the topic of warfighters again and warrior mindset, but when you see all of these guys coming home from 20 or 30 years of combat, they bring with them, tactics, techniques, and procedures that are proven under stress and harsh conditions. So, you can find MMA schools and BJJ schools, and you can find firearms instruction schools and stuff like that. I think in many cases, because they're so pro law enforcement, which isn't super common right now, they'll work with you or help you within the confines of your salary and your disposable income to get you up and running. So I would advocate for them to reach out to the closest BJJ school, explain their circumstances, ask if they have something law enforcement specific. The vast majority do now. And if anybody watching or listening to this has a problem finding a place where they live, send me a message. You can find me on Instagram. You can find me on our webpage, which we'll talk about at the end, but just send me a note and I will find that spot for you, because I'm vested in that.
Right. Thank you, Todd. I appreciate it. So video is a significant source of what happens nowadays. That seems to be what everybody's looking at: body camera, in-car camera, surveillance video, and so on. And it sheds light on a lot of incidents as they unfold. Not always, but in most cases it does. What are your thoughts about agencies releasing that footage as quickly as they can?
First, let me agree with what you said. In my experience, as a broad stroke, not always, as a broad stroke, body cams help. They help police and they help demonstrate and show. I don't know how many times, people have said X, and when you look at the footage, it's Y. It's not at all that. By and large, that said, it does miss context frequently. So you have to have that context from other sources. When you look at communities who have a strong distrust for law enforcement, I think it's extremely important to get that footage out quickly. However, you can't lack the other context. So if there's a policy in place that says, hey, we're going to review this as fast as possible, we will release footage on this, you will see it in X amount of time. I don't know, what that is. Let's say it's 48 hours on average. You figure out that you can release this after you've collected this footage, and you have a team dedicated to collecting, the key variables in the equation so that they can present it with some level of completeness. And things take time, as you know, but we can get out in front of it. You don't have weeks or months of mistrust building up. I think it's important. It's a big deal. When you hear people talking about these subjects on the civilian side, they don't understand use of force. They don't understand the factors that contribute to it. And if you can show, hey, here's how it actually unfolded. I'm starting to see that. I'm seeing that in major markets. I don't know so much about local communities, let's say under 50 people, being able to get out that quick. But with a lot of big cities, I'm seeing now them breaking down the incident and doing kind of an AAR for the general population. They're able to show them the key factors. And then at least for the rational people who are willing to look at the evidence, they're going to calm down and hopefully calm down the people around them that are screaming, yelling things that aren't true. So I'm an advocate for that. I believe that the cameras tend to help LEOs. And I also believe that PIO is getting out in front of it and getting that information, getting that video footage out there on use of force, but with context is really important for the community.
Context is so important. Todd, do you do expert witness testimony for courts?
I don't. That's been offered to me now for my entire time in, and I don't do that. And so I'm still running a protective services business, and we spend a large percentage of our time overseas. And when I come home, I want to relax. I don't want to go be an expert witness. And
I'm sure.
and unfortunately, there's two sides to that, and I want to make sure that I protect the right people. But I don't.
Todd, where can people find your book, Underpinning?
My book in the e-format is on all the standard websites. You can go to Amazon, you can go to Apple, Barnes & Noble, all of the standard platforms that people get ebooks from. And then our website, Tour Protection, has the actual paperback book. So I've written 5 books. This is the most recent book. So you'll see I cycle through putting out there the paperback, and then after X amount of time, usually when we get to about 5,000 copies, I'll stop the paperbacks and it'll just be an ebook. So tourprotection.com is for the paperback, Amazon, Apple, Barnes & Noble for everything else.
I'll add all that into the show notes so that people can find the book. Todd, is there anything else you'd like to add?
The thing that I would like people in general to understand is that training changes behavior. And so if you want a behavior change, you're going to have to train it into people. It's not just going to naturally unfold or occur. So training is critical. It's something that in law enforcement right now, people don't get a whole lot of training in 1 or 2 specific things. What they end up doing is becoming, a jack of all trades. And as time goes on, they get tasked with more and more duties, which means that, they're less of an expert or subject matter expert in one particular field. And when people consider use of force, in particular, the use of deadly force, or at least at that level, it's important to know that these officers aren't getting a lot of time doing this. So if they want a better response, they need to give them more training. And I know that Leos broadly know that, but the community needs to know that. So anybody out there that's screaming or crying for that, training is the solution. And that means they've got to find the funding for that, and they've got to find the time for that. So to change behavior, you need training.
Thank you. Todd, I didn't ask you this. Talk about the business you have, Tour Protection, and what you do with that.
So my business, by and large, is focused on celebrity. So we deal with actors and musicians who go on tour or shoot a film in a foreign country. It's 80% of our business. The remainder is governmental, executives, dignitaries, things like that. So we basically do everything that surrounds that entity. So let's say it's a music tour or film. We would go to the country. We would set up a local national force. So we'd set up the airport and the hotel and the vehicles and the drivers and the local security and the permits and the firearms and whatever it may be. We'd get the client, we'd bring them in, we'd bring them into that secure bubble, that structure. We'd do whatever the task was. Let's say it's a film or a concert or a public speaking event. And then we'd move out, and then we kind of break down the thing that we built up, and we do it in the next city, and we go city to city, country to country. So in my case now, I've operated in 100 countries. I'm lost on the number of cities that I've done, but we move a lot. We move a whole lot. We move with very high profile people, most of them who have threats against them.
And I'm sure in this day and age with the social media and stuff, following people around, it makes it even harder to do your job and to be effective.
Ironically, most of our threats come from the inside, and, containing or retaining information is very difficult because most of that information is going out from our clients, and then they wonder how they knew they were there when they were taking pictures from their hotel room window, and you can see all of the buildings and structures that are there, so everybody can identify which hotel you're at. So yeah, it's changed, in the last 25 years that I've been doing, it's changed completely.
Wow. Okay, great. Todd, let's go to some rapid fire questions.
Let's do it.
Texting or talking?
Texting.
Chocolate or vanilla?
Chocolate.
Coffee or
Coffee.
adult drink of choice?
It depends on if I have food or don't have food. If I have food, it's a Barolo. If I don't have food, probably a Guinness.
What would be a superpower if you could have one?
The ability to understand the meaning of life.
Ask permission or beg for forgiveness?
Depends on what it is. As I get older, I'm begging for forgiveness more.
Place you most want to travel to, and you've traveled a lot.
Hard. I've been almost everywhere, but if we talk about going back anywhere, I think the next place that I'm going to go back to is probably Sardinia.
If you could choose to have coffee with any historical figure, living or dead, who would it be?
Probably David Galula, and you'll have to research who he is and what he did, but David Galula is a guy that has a lot of attention for me.
Todd, any key points you'd like to answer, or I should say, I'm sorry, any key points that you'd like to let our listeners know about?
If people want something from Leos, they have to lobby for it. They have to push for it. They have to support it. And again, it starts with training. So, figure out what your local community leaders are pushing for. And then when they don't get, something, say, did you ask for it? Did you push for it? Communication is a big part of it, but pushing for that training. I know I've said this repeatedly, but training changes behavior.
How can people best reach out to you if they want to connect or ask any questions?
Probably the easiest way is through our website, tourprotection.com, TOUR. And you'll find a number, you'll find email address, that kind of stuff. And then on Instagram, it's at Tour Training. At Tour Training, you can hit me via DM there. We try to do things related to security and protection, fighting, defensive tactics, stuff like that. So it might be interesting to see some photos or videos there as well.
And I will add all that into our show notes. Todd, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Robert.